The lecture hall stretched across 3 levels of the Galactic Survival Institute on Theta Prime, filled with students from 40 different species across known space. Professor Zelthar stood at the center podium, their crystalline body refracting the light into rainbow patterns across the curved walls. The professor's voice carried through the translation devices that every student wore, making their words understandable to all. Today we examine the most hostile environments in our galaxy, Zelthar announced, gesturing to the massive holographic display that floated above them. The display showed a planet covered entirely in ice, its surface whipped by storms that never seemed to end. This is Cryo 7. The professor continued. Surface temperature averages -150 degrees in your Celsius measurements. Wind speeds regularly exceed 200 kilometers per hour. Atmospheric pressure is barely sufficient for most oxygen-breathing species. The students watched as the hologram zoomed closer, showing jagged ice formations and snow that moved like ocean waves across the frozen wasteland. A Thaxian student in the front row raised one of their 4 arms. Professor, has anyone ever survived on Cryo 7 without environmental suits or heated shelters? Zelthar's crystalline face formed what their species used as a smile. An excellent question. The Vrulians, with their thick insulating fur and internal heat generation, can survive for approximately 6 hours. The molten cores from Paraxis can maintain their body temperature for nearly 10 hours, though they find it extremely uncomfortable. But most species would perish within minutes. Marcus Chan sat in the back row, listening carefully as he always did. He was the only human in the advanced survival class, one of only 3 humans currently studying at the Galactic Survival Institute. His species was relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 70 years ago. Professor Zelthar continued the lecture, now showing images of other death worlds. Each one seemed more impossible than the last acid rain planets, worlds with gravity strong enough to crush most beings, radiation-soaked rocks orbiting dying stars. The key to survival, Zelthar explained, is biological adaptation. Species that evolved on harsh worlds carry the tools for survival in their very biology. Those from gentler worlds, unfortunately, lack these advantages. The professor's gaze seemed to drift toward the back of the room, toward Marcus. Take humans, for example, Zelthar said. And Marcus felt every eye in the lecture hall turn toward him. They evolved on a relatively mild planet with moderate temperatures and abundant resources. No natural armor, no thermal regulation beyond basic mammalian functions, no environmental resistance of note. Soft-worlders, as we classify them in survival taxonomy. Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly, but said nothing. He had heard variations of this assessment before from various professors and fellow students. The galaxy seemed to view humans as fragile newcomers who had gotten lucky with their planet's conditions. A crystalline student near the front spoke up. Professor, didn't humans colonize some harsh environments on their own world before achieving spaceflight? Zelthar made a dismissive gesture with one translucent arm. Desert regions, cold areas, yes, but always with significant technological support. Clothing, fire, constructed shelters. Strip away the technology and humans are as vulnerable as any soft-worlder. Marcus raised his hand. The gesture was unusual enough in the galactic academic setting that it took a moment for Professor Zelthar to notice. Yes, Student Chan? With respect, Professor, that's not entirely accurate, Marcus said, keeping his voice polite but firm. Humans did survive in extreme environments with minimal technology. Our ancestors lived in Arctic conditions for thousands of years before modern heating systems existed. Zelthar's crystalline body seemed to brighten slightly. A sign of what Marcus had learned was amusement among their species. Survived, perhaps, but thrived? I think not, Your species required fire, animal skins, complex shelters. That is not adaptation, Student Chan. That is compensation for the lack of adaptation. Several students made sounds that Marcus recognized as agreement or laughter, depending on the species. He felt his face grow warm, but kept his composure. The ability to adapt through ingenuity is still adaptation. Marcus replied, perhaps even more valuable than fixed biological traits, because it allows for flexibility across multiple environments. The professor approached Marcus's row, their footsteps making a strange chiming sound against the floor, an interesting philosophical position. Zelthar said, but philosophy does not keep one alive on Crivo 7. Would you care to test your theory of human adaptability, Student Chun? Marcus felt his heart rate increase. He knew he was being challenged, possibly even mocked, but something in him refused to back down. What did you have in mind, Professor? Zelthar gestured to the hologram of Crivo 7 still rotating above them. A simple demonstration. I will transport you to the surface of Crivo 7 in standard survival gear. You will have 10 minutes to construct a shelter using only materials found on the planet's surface. If you can create something that allows you to survive comfortably for an additional 20 minutes, I will formally withdraw my classification of humans as unsuitable for frontier colonization work. If you fail, humanity accepts the classification without further argument. The lecture hall erupted in excited chatter. Students turned to each other. Discussing the challenge in dozens of languages, Marcus took a deep breath. 10 minutes seemed impossible. But something in his memory stirred stories his grandmother had told him about their Inuit heritage. About survival in the Arctic before modern technology, I accept, Marcus said, Professor. Zelthar's body flashed bright with what might have been surprise or satisfaction. Excellent. We will conduct this demonstration immediately. Class, prepare for field observation. The professor tapped commands into their wrist device. Student Chun, report to the transportation chamber. You will be equipped with standard thermal gear rated for -100 degrees. Nothing more. The timer will begin the moment you set foot on Crivo 7's surface. Marcus stood, feeling the weight of dozens of alien eyes upon him. Reliant student leaned toward their companion and whispered something that Marcus's translator picked up. Poor creature will be back in the observation dome within 3 minutes. Another student, a molten core, shook their head. I give him 1 minute before the cold becomes unbearable. Humans are notoriously sensitive to temperature extremes. Marcus walked down the steps toward the exit, his mind already racing through everything he remembered. About cold weather survival, his grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, telling stories of their ancestors who had lived on the ice for generations. They had survived without fusion reactors or thermal regulators. They had used what the ice itself provided. As Marcus reached the transportation chamber, Professor Zelthar followed with several assistants carrying monitoring equipment. Any questions before we begin, Student Chum? Marcus shook his head. No questions, Professor. Then let us see if human ingenuity is truly sufficient for the frontier, Zelthar said, or if your species is indeed too fragile for the harsher realities of our galaxy. The transportation chamber hummed to life around Marcus as he stepped inside. Through the transparent walls, he could see his classmates filing into the observation dome that would keep them safe and warm while they watched. Had 10 minutes to prove humanity's worth to the galaxy. 10 minutes to show that survival wasn't just about biological advantages, it was about knowledge, creativity, and the willingness to use the environment instead of fighting against it. The transportation sequence initiated, and Marcus felt the familiar disorientation of instantaneous travel when his vision cleared. He was standing on a world of endless ice and howling wind. The countdown had begun. The cold hit Marcus like a physical blow the moment he materialized on the surface of Crivo 7, even through the thermal suit that covered him from neck to boots. He could feel the temperature trying to steal every bit of warmth from his body. The wind screamed across the ice plain, carrying snow and ice crystals that pelted against his face mask with sounds like tiny hammers. Marcus stumbled slightly, catching his balance on the uneven surface. His breath formed clouds of vapor that instantly froze into tiny ice particles inside his mask. He could already feel the cold creeping through the suit's insulation, a reminder that the gear was rated for -100 degrees, not the -150 that Cryo 7 offered. Through his mask's heads-up display, Marcus could see the countdown timer that Professor Zelthar had started. 9 minutes and 45 seconds remaining. Behind him, visible through the swirling snow, stood the observation dome. Its transparent walls showed the warm interior, where his classmates gathered to watch what most of them clearly expected to be his rapid failure. Marcus could see them gesturing, their mouths moving in conversation he couldn't hear. The observation dome's communication system crackled to life in his helmet. "Student Chun, your vital signs are being monitored," Professor Zelthar's voice announced. "We will extract you immediately if you show signs of dangerous hypothermia. Do you wish to proceed or withdraw your acceptance of this challenge?" Marcus turned away from the dome, facing the endless expanse of ice and snow that stretched to the horizon in every direction. "I'm proceeding, Professor," he said into his helmet microphone inside the dome. Marcus couldn't see it, but several students were already placing bets on how long he would last. The Thaxian student held up 2 of their 4 fingers. 2 minutes before he runs back to the dome, they predicted. The human will realize this is impossible and preserve his life rather than his pride. Avrelian shook their large furred head. "Less than that. Look at him just standing there. He has no plan." Humans are impulsive and emotional. They accept challenges without thinking them through. But one student, a young crystalline named Zelma, who had worked with Marcus on previous projects, watched more carefully. "He's not just standing," Zelma observed. "Look at his posture. He's analyzing the environment." Professor Zelthar noted this comment but said nothing. Watching the human through the dome's enhanced viewing system, Marcus was indeed analyzing everything around him. He slowly turned in a circle, examining the landscape with eyes that his ancestors had used to read ice and snow for thousands of years. The wind came primarily from one direction, northeast, according to his suit's basic compass that mattered for shelter positioning. The snow beneath his feet was packed hard in some places, softer in others. Where it had drifted, he knelt down, ignoring the cold that immediately seeped through his suit's knee padding with his gloved hand. He pressed into the snow. Too soft here, too powdery. He moved 3 meters to his left and tried again. Better. This was more compact. He stood and walked in a widening spiral pattern, testing the snow every few steps. The timer showed 8 minutes remaining inside the observation dome. The Thaxian student made a confused gesture. What is he doing? Why is he playing in the snow like a juvenile? Perhaps the cold has already affected his brain function, suggested a molten core student. I have read that human cognitive abilities decline rapidly in extreme temperatures. Zelena continued to watch Marcus with growing interest. No, there is purpose to his movements. He is searching for something specific, but what could possibly help him out there? Marcus found what he was looking for about 20 meters from his starting point, a patch where the snow had been compressed by the constant wind, packed so tightly that it had almost become icy. Pressed it with his hand, then stamped on it with his boot. It barely gave under his weight. Perfect. He pulled the survival knife from his belt. Standard issue for all students in the survival program, the blade was designed to cut through various materials, from rope to soft metals. He had never tried using it on snow, but he knew it would work. Marcus had 7 minutes left. He knelt beside the compacted snow and began cutting. The blade sank into the snow with some resistance. and he carved out a rectangular block roughly half a meter long, a third of a meter wide, and a quarter meter deep inside the observation dome. Confusion turned to complete bafflement. "He's cutting blocks of snow," a student announced unnecessarily as they all watched. "Why would he build something from the very substance that is trying to kill him?" Professor Zelthar leaned forward slightly. Their crystalline eyes focused intently on Marcus. They had studied survival techniques from hundreds of species across thousands of worlds. They had never seen anything quite like this. Marcus lifted the first block, free from the surrounding snow, and set it aside. His hands were already getting cold. Despite the thermal gloves, he worked faster, cutting a second block, then a third. The repetitive motion helped keep his blood flowing, fighting back the cold that wanted to settle into his muscles. 6 minutes remained. He had cut 8 blocks now, and he began arranging them in a circle. Each block was placed with its long edge on the ground, tilted slightly inward. Marcus worked from memory, from stories and pictures his grandmother had shown him, from videos he had watched as a child. Fascinated by his heritage, the blocks formed a spiral as he placed them, each one supporting the next. Each one tilted just a bit more than the last. "It's a circular wall," observed the Vrelian student, "but it will not protect him from the wind. The gaps between the blocks are too large, and even if they were sealed, cold passes through ice as if it were nothing." But Zelena noticed something else. "The spiral is rising," they said. "Each block is placed higher than the previous one. He is not building a wall. He is building a dome." Professor Jelthar's body flashed bright blue, a sign of intense focus. "Impossible," they murmured. "The structural integrity would never hold. The blocks would collapse inward." 5 minutes remained on the countdown. Marcus worked through the pain in his fingers now, the cold making every movement more difficult. His breathing came harder, each breath burning cold in his lungs. Despite the mask's heating elements, he cut more blocks from the compacted snow, his spiral of ice rising higher with each addition. The angle of each block was critical, leaning inward just enough to support the next layer, not so much that it would collapse. His ancestors had perfected this technique over countless generations. They had understood that snow and ice, properly used, could protect against snow and ice. The structure was half complete now, rising to about waist height from inside the observation dome. It looked like a strange igloo taking shape, though none of the alien students had any reference for that word. 4 minutes left. Marcus's hands shook with cold and exhaustion. He had to pause for a moment, forcing his fingers to flex inside his gloves, trying to maintain circulation. The wind howled louder, as if Cryo 7 itself was angry at his attempt to defy its harsh nature. "His body temperature has dropped 2 degrees, announced one of Professor Zelthar's assistants, monitoring Marcus's vital signs. "Heart rate is elevated from physical exertion. Should we abort the demonstration?" Zelthar watched Marcus resume his work, cutting more blocks despite his obvious discomfort. "Not yet," the professor said. "He has not signaled for extraction. We will honor the terms of the challenge unless his life is in immediate danger." Marcus placed another block, then another. The dome structure grew taller, the spiral tightening as it rose. He had to stand now to place the upper blocks, reaching up with hands that barely responded to his commands. 3 minutes remained. The structure was nearly complete. Just the top opening left. Marcus cut smaller blocks now, sized to fit the narrowing gap at the top of the dome inside the observation dome. Students pressed closer to the transparent walls, watching in silent fascination. Whatever they had expected, this was not. The human was building something none of them had seen before, using nothing but frozen water and a simple blade. 2 minutes left. Marcus placed the final blocks, leaving only a small opening at the very top. His entire body shook with cold now, and he knew he was approaching the limits of what the thermal suit could protect against, but the structure was complete. Except for one crucial element he used his knife to cut. A low tunnel entrance at the base of the dome. Barely large enough to crawl through, the wind would not be able to blow directly into the shelter this way. Heat would be trapped inside while cold air stayed low and flowed out 1 minute 30 seconds. Marcus took his knife and carefully carved a small ventilation hole near the top of the dome. Fresh air would enter, but heat would not escape quickly then. He dropped to his hands and knees and crawled through the low entrance tunnel. He disappeared from the view of the watching students inside the observation dome. Excited chatter broke out. "He's just hiding in there," insisted the Thaxian student. "That proves nothing. The shelter is made of ice. It will be just as cold inside as outside, perhaps colder, as the wind cannot help circulate warmer air." But Professor Zelthar was already checking Marcus's vital signs on the monitoring display. What they saw made their crystalline body flash in surprise. "His core temperature," Zelthar said slowly, "is rising." The countdown timer reached 0. Marcus had completed his challenge with 90 seconds to spare, but the real test was just beginning. Inside the ice dome, Marcus sat in complete darkness for a moment, listening to the muffled howl of the wind outside. Small space was barely large enough for him to sit upright with his knees drawn up. Maybe 2 meters across at its widest point, he reached up and activated the small emergency light built into his helmet. Soft blue illumination filled the interior of his shelter, revealing walls of white and pale blue ice blocks spiraling up to the small vent hole he had cut at the top. Marcus could already feel the difference. The wind no longer tore at him constantly, no longer stealing heat from every exposed surface. The temperature inside the dome was still brutally cold, probably close to -100 degrees. But it was not getting colder. More importantly, it was about to get warmer. He spoke into his helmet microphone, knowing the observers in the dome would hear him. "The shelter is complete, Professor," Marcus said between breaths that were still visible as vapor. "I'm prepared to remain here for the additional 20 minutes as agreed." In the observation dome, Professor Zelthar stared at the monitoring displays with an expression their species used for deep confusion. "Student Chun, your vital signs show your core temperature rising," the professor said. "This should not be possible. You are surrounded by ice in an environment of -150 degrees. Please explain what is happening." Marcus allowed himself a small smile inside his helmet. "The ice blocks contain trapped air," he began, his voice steady despite his shivering. "Air is an excellent insulator when it's not moving. The packed snow has thousands of tiny air pockets throughout its structure. Those air pockets prevent heat transfer from inside the shelter to outside." Several students in the observation dome exchanged confused looks. A molten core student spoke up, their voice translated through the communication system. "But Student Chun, ice is thermally conductive. We use ice to cool our environmental systems. How can it insulate?" Marcus shifted position slightly, trying to warm his extremities. "Ice is conductive, yes, but this isn't solid ice. It's compacted snow that's been cut into blocks. The structure of snow is crystalline with air spaces between the crystals. Even packed hard, it still contains significant air. That air acts as an insulator." He could feel his body heat beginning to warm the small interior space. The thermal suit was designed to retain body heat. And now that heat had nowhere to escape quickly, the dome shape prevented warm air from simply rising away, and the low entrance tunnel prevented cold air from pouring in. Zaina, the young crystalline student, made a gesture of understanding. "The structure traps the heat that Student Chun's own body produces," they said. "The design is elegant in its simplicity. Use the environment's own materials, but restructure them to create a thermal barrier." Professor Zelthar's body flickered through several colors. indicating complex emotional processing. Show us the interior, the professor commanded. We wish to observe this phenomenon. Marcus reached up and activated the helmet's external camera, streaming video back to the observation dome. The alien students crowded around the display screens, showing the inside of the ice shelter. They saw the curved walls rising in a perfect spiral, saw the small ventilation hole at the top where a tiny amount of light filtered in, saw the low tunnel entrance. Most striking was the frost beginning to form on the interior surface of the ice blocks closest to Marcus. The inside surface is warming, noted one of Professor Zelthar's assistants. The frost indicates the ice is approaching its melting point near Student Chun. How is his body producing enough heat for this? Marcus explained, feeling warmth returning to his fingers and toes. Human metabolism generates approximately 100 watts of heat at rest. More during physical activity. All the exertion of cutting blocks and building the shelter increased my heat production. In a normal environment, that heat dissipates into the air through convection and radiation. Here, the shelter prevents most of that heat loss. The warm air stays trapped inside with me. He paused, checking his suit's internal thermometer. The temperature inside the shelter has risen to -90 degrees. He reported, still cold. But my thermal suit is designed to handle this. I can remain here comfortably for hours, not just 20 minutes. The alien students watched in fascination as the frost on the interior walls began to thicken. Slightly, some of the ice blocks nearest to Marcus showed a faint glaze of moisture that immediately refroze into a smooth coating. The moisture from my breath is condensing on the walls. Marcus continued. As it freezes, it actually seals the gaps between the blocks and creates an even better insulating layer. My ancestors called this process glazing. After a few hours, the interior of one of these shelters becomes almost airtight. A Relian student made a sound of disbelief. Your ancestors built these structures without modern tools or materials on your homeworld? Marcus nodded, forgetting for a moment that they couldn't see him clearly. Yes, he said. The Inuit people of Earth's Arctic regions developed this technology thousands of years ago. They survived in temperatures similar to Cryo 7, sometimes for months at a time. They had no thermal suits, no fusion reactors, no advanced materials, just knowledge passed down through generations about how to work with ice and snow instead of against it. Professor Zelthar moved closer to the display screens, studying every detail of the shelter's construction. The spiral pattern, the professor said slowly. It is mathematically precise. Each block supports the weight of those above it through careful angling. The dome shape distributes force evenly. This is sophisticated engineering. Marcus felt warmth spreading through his core now, his body recovering from the initial shock of cold exposure. My grandmother taught me the principles, he said. She learned from her grandmother, who learned from hers. The knowledge goes back hundreds of generations. Humans might not have biological adaptations for extreme cold, but we have something else. We have the ability to learn from our environment and from each other. We can pass knowledge across time. Inside the observation dome, students who had been certain of Marcus's failure now watched in respectful silence. Some of them were making recordings of the shelter structure, analyzing the angles and proportions. The Thaxian student, who had predicted Marcus would last only 2 minutes, spoke quietly to a companion. I underestimated them, the Thaxian admitted. This human has shown us something none of our survival courses have covered. Adaptive construction using hostile environmental materials. Zelena approached Professor Zelthar with excitement in their crystalline features. Professor, this technique could be applied to dozens of worlds we've classified as unsurvivable, Zelena said. Any planet with frozen water could potentially support temporary or even long-term habitation using this method. We've been approaching survival incorrectly. We've focused on bringing our own materials and technology to hostile worlds. Student Chun is showing us how to use what the hostile world provides. Professor Zelthar stood in silence for a long moment. Processing this information, everything they had taught for decades about survival theory was being challenged by a simple structure made of snow. The professor's pride wanted to find fault with the demonstration. To point out limitations or special circumstances, but they're scientific. Integrity demanded recognition of observable truth. Marcus's core temperature had stabilized. At a healthy level, his heart rate had returned to normal by every measurable standard. He was surviving comfortably in an environment that should have driven him back to the heated observation dome within minutes. Student Chun, Professor Zelthar said finally, "You have made your point. However, I wish to observe the full duration we agreed upon. Please remain in your shelter for the remaining 16 minutes. We are gathering detailed scans of the structure." For academic study, Marcus settled more comfortably against the ice wall. The surface that had seemed impossibly cold minutes ago now felt merely cool against his back. "Understood, Professor," he replied. "I'm quite comfortable here. In fact, if I had a heat source like a small fire or even a candle, I could raise the interior temperature above freezing. The shelter would maintain that warmth with minimal energy input." This statement caused another wave of excited discussion. Among the students, a fire inside a structure made of ice seemed paradoxical. Yet Marcus spoke of it as simple fact. "That is counterintuitive," said a molten core student. "Surely, the heat would melt the structure." Marcus shook his head. "The heat melts only the innermost layer, creating that glaze I mentioned. The outer layers remain frozen because the exterior temperature is so low. The result is a structure that gets stronger and more insulating over time, not weaker. My ancestors heated their ice shelters to comfortable living temperatures. Families would sleep inside them, cook meals, raise children, all in the middle of frozen wastelands." Professor Zelthar made rapid notes on a datapad, their crystalline fingers moving with unusual urgency. "This will require significant revision of our survival curricula." The professor murmured, "We have overlooked an entire category of survival adaptation. Tool use and knowledge transmission as evolutionary advantages, equivalent to biological specialization." The remaining minutes passed quickly as Marcus answered questions from curious students. News of Marcus Chen's demonstration spread through the Galactic Survival Institute within hours. By the next day, it had reached the broader academic community on Theta Prime within a week. Every major university and survival training facility in known space had heard about the human who built a shelter from the very element that was trying to kill him. Marcus found himself suddenly famous. Though he felt uncomfortable with the attention, he had simply used knowledge his ancestors had developed, nothing more. But to the galactic community, what he had done was revolutionary. The morning after his demonstration, Marcus arrived at his next class to find the lecture hall packed with students from programs he had never even heard of. Engineering students, xenobiologists, colonial planning specialists, even military strategic officers filled every available seat. Professor Zelthar stood at the podium, their crystalline body reflecting rainbow patterns as always. But something had changed in the professor's demeanor. Where before there had been certainty and perhaps a touch of condescension, now there was curiosity and respect. "Student Chun," Professor Zelthar announced as Marcus entered, "I have taken the liberty of restructuring today's curriculum. The administration has requested that you provide a detailed explanation of your construction technique. We have attendees from 17 different academic departments." Marcus felt his stomach tighten with nervousness. He was a student, not a professor. Speaking to a handful of classmates was one thing, but addressing this crowd was another. "Professor, I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach," Marcus Begangsel made a gesture that Marcus had learned meant gentle dismissal of concern. You possess knowledge that none of us have. The professor said, that makes you the most qualified being in this room on this particular subject. Please, share what you know. Marcus walked to the center of the lecture hall. Feeling dozens of alien eyes watching him, he took a deep breath and began. The shelter I built is called an igloo. He explained. The word comes from the Inuit language of my ancestors. It means house. To them, it wasn't a primitive survival technique. It was simply their home. He activated the holographic display. Showing images from Earth's Arctic regions, ancient photographs appeared. Showing Inuit families standing beside dome-shaped ice structures. These people lived in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Marcus continued. Temperatures regularly dropped below -40 degrees. Storms could last for days. Food was scarce, but they didn't just survive. They thrived. A Vrelian student raised their hand. How did they learn to build these structures? Was there a single inventor? Marcus shook his head. The knowledge developed over thousands of years through trial and error. One generation would make a small improvement and teach it to their children. Those children would make their own improvements and pass them on. The igloo we see today is the result of countless refinements across hundreds of generations. He showed diagrams of igloo construction, pointing out the mathematical precision involved. The spiral pattern isn't just aesthetic, Marcus explained. It's structural engineering. Each block is tilted at approximately 15 degrees inward. This creates a catenary curve, which is naturally stable. The same principle is used in arch construction across many civilizations. Professor Zelthar leaned forward with interest. So your ancestors understood advanced structural mathematics? Even without formal education in engineering? Marcus smiled. They understood it practically. Through experience. They might not have been able to write the equations, but they knew exactly what angles worked. They could build an igloo in complete darkness during a blizzard by feel alone. That's knowledge encoded in practice, passed down through teaching and demonstration. Crystalline student made a sound of fascination. This is similar to how we preserve information in our crystalline matrices. They said, knowledge embedded in structure rather than written language. A different form of data storage. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Humans used multiple methods to preserve knowledge before we developed writing. Stories, songs, practical demonstrations, apprenticeships. The igloo is one example, but there are thousands of others. He showed more images now, displaying various human survival techniques from different environments, dirt-dwelling peoples who knew how to find water beneath seemingly barren sand island cultures that could navigate across thousands of kilometers of ocean, using only stars and wave patterns, forest, communities that could identify hundreds of edible plants and predict weather changes. Days in advance, every environment on Earth produced human cultures that learned to read it, understand it, and work with it. Marcus explained. We didn't evolve biological adaptations for these places. We evolved the ability to learn and to teach. That's our adaptation. The lecture hall remained silent as students processed this information. Many of them came from species with specific environmental adaptations. The Vrelians had thick fur for cold worlds. Molten cores had internal heat generation. The Thaxians had redundant respiratory systems for thin atmospheres. But none of them had thought of adaptability itself as an adaptation. A military officer, a scaled one from a heavy gravity world, stood up. Student Chun, could this technique be taught to other species? For instance, could I learn to build one of these igloos? Marcus considered the question. The physical requirements are minimal. He said, you need to be able to cut blocks from compacted snow and stack them in a spiral pattern. Most species with manipulative appendages could do this. The real requirement is understanding the principles, why the spiral works, how to angle the blocks, where to place the entrance and ventilation. Once you understand those principles, yes, any species could learn. Professor Zelthar stood, addressing the gathered crowd. This raises an important question. The professor said, how much other survival knowledge exists among the various species of the galaxy that we have not properly documented or shared? We have focused on biological adaptations and technological solutions. We may have overlooked a vast repository of practical knowledge developed by pre-technological civilizations. A xenobiologist in the upper rows called out, I have studied 17 species in various stages of development. Many have sophisticated environmental knowledge that we dismissed as primitive or irrelevant once. They achieved spaceflight. Perhaps we should be preserving and studying this knowledge instead. The discussion that followed lasted for hours. Students and faculty debated the nature of adaptation, the value of traditional knowledge, and how to incorporate these concepts into survival training. Marcus found himself at the center of it all, answering questions and explaining concepts he had learned from his grandmother without ever thinking of them as revolutionary. As the session finally wound down, Zelena approached Marcus with obvious excitement. Student Chun, I have a proposal. The young crystalline said, my family operates a colonial development company. We're preparing to establish settlements on 12 new frontier worlds. 4 of them have frozen regions where your igloo technique could be invaluable. Would you be willing to consult on shelter design for these colonies? Marcus felt overwhelmed. I'm just a student, he protested. I barely passed my orbital mechanics exam last term. Zelena's crystalline features flickered with what Marcus had learned was their version of a smile. You may be a student in most subjects, Zelena said, but in this, you are a master. You carry knowledge that is thousands of years old. That makes you more qualified than any newly graduated expert. Over the following weeks, Marcus's life changed dramatically. He continued his regular studies, but now he also served as a consultant on cold weather survival techniques. He taught workshops on igloo construction, bringing groups of students and professionals to Cryo 7 to practice building the shelters. Professor Zelthar became his advocate, proposing a new course in the survival program curriculum. Traditional environmental knowledge across cultures would be taught starting the next term. Marcus would be a guest lecturer, sharing what his grandmother had taught him alongside knowledge from other human cultures. But the most significant change came from an unexpected source, the Galactic Colonial Authority, the body responsible for approving new settlements on frontier worlds. Sent a formal inquiry. They wanted to know if igloo construction could be standardized and taught to all colonial teams. Heading to ice worlds, Marcus spent a full week working with engineers and architects to create comprehensive building guides. They developed modifications for different atmospheric pressures, various ice compositions, and the needs of different species of Relian required more interior space due to their larger size. A molten core needed additional ventilation to prevent overheating. A crystalline needed transparent sections to allow light transmission. Each variation maintained the core principles Marcus had demonstrated. Use the environment's own materials. Create insulation through trapped air. Designed for heat retention. The guides were published and distributed throughout galactic space. Suddenly, igloos were being built on dozens of worlds. Human knowledge that had been developed in Earth's Arctic was now protecting colonists under alien stars. Marcus's grandmother called him via quantum communication, her elderly face beaming with pride on the video screen. 6 months after his demonstration on Cryo 7, Marcus Chun stood once again on the frozen surface of that harsh world. But this time, he was not alone. 23 students from 8 different species stood in a wide circle around him, all wearing thermal suits rated for the brutal cold. The wind howled across the ice plain as it always did, carrying snow and frozen particles that created a constant white haze. But the students stood firm, waiting for instruction. Building an igloo is not about fighting the environment. Marcus called out over the wind, his voice transmitted through their helmet communication systems. It's about understanding that the environment can provide what you need to survive. The cold that wants to kill you also gives you the ice that will protect you. He knelt and pressed his gloved hand into the packed snow at his feet. First, you must find good snow, he continued. Too soft, and it won't hold its shape. Too hard, and you won't be able to cut it properly. You're looking for snow that has been compressed by wind over time. The students spread out across the ice, testing. The snow, as Marcus had taught Thema of Relian named Keth, found a suitable patch and called out in excitement. Here, Instructor Chun. This snow is firm, but cuts when I press my knife into it. Marcus walked over. His boots crunching on the frozen surface, he examined Keth's find and nodded with approval. Perfect, he said. Now remember what I taught you about cutting the blocks. Use smooth, even strokes. The blocks should be uniform in size or the structure won't be stable. Keth began cutting while Marcus moved among the other students. Offering guidance and corrections, a young crystalline was struggling to grip the knife properly. With their faceted hands, Marcus showed them an alternative technique. Using the edge of their natural crystalline structure to score the snow before cutting a molten core. Student had cut blocks that were too large and was exhausting themselves trying to lift. Then Marcus helped them understand the proper proportions. Large enough to be structurally sound, but small enough to handle this, was the fifth workshop Marcus had led on Crivo 7. Word had spread through the Galactic Survival Institute that his classes were transformative students who completed his igloo building. Course went on to apply the same principles of environmental adaptation to other survival scenarios Professor Zelthar observed from the heated dome. Recording every detail, the professor had become one of Marcus's strongest supporters, having acknowledged publicly that the challenge issued 6 months ago had been based on incorrect assumptions about human capability. The students are progressing well, Zelena commented, standing beside Zelthar in the observation dome. The young crystalline had become Marcus's teaching assistant, helping coordinate the workshops and document the techniques. Student Chun has a gift for instruction, Professor. Zelthar agreed. He makes complex principles accessible through clear explanation and patient demonstration. Many of our traditional professors could learn from his teaching methods. Outside, Marcus watched as his students began assembling their practice igloos. 23 structures slowly took shape across the ice plane, each one slightly different, as students adapted the basic technique to their own physical capabilities. Athaxian. With 4 arms found, they could work faster by cutting and placing blocks simultaneously. Relian's natural strength allowed them to use larger blocks and build more quickly. Crystalline's mathematical precision resulted in a structure of remarkable geometric perfection. Marcus felt pride watching them work. Each student was taking the knowledge his grandmother had passed to him and making it their own. They weren't just copying. They were innovating, adapting the ancient Inuit technique to new circumstances and new builders. Instructor Chen called out a scaled 1 student named Mrek. My entrance tunnel keeps collapsing. What am I doing wrong? Marcus trudged through the snow to examine Mrek's work. He saw the problem immediately. The tunnel had been carved at too steep an angle. Remember, the entrance needs to be lower than the main floor of the igloo. Marcus explained. Cold air sinks, so this keeps it flowing out while warm air stays trapped inside. Make your tunnel more horizontal and longer. Mrek nodded and began adjusting the design. Marcus moved on to the next student who needed help. 2 hours later, all 23 practice igloos stood complete. Some were rough and would need significant improvement, but others showed real craftsmanship. Marcus led the students through the next phase, testing their shelters. Each student crawled into their creation, and sealed the entrance with a snow block. Marcus monitored their vital signs through the central communication system, watching as interior temperatures began to rise. Remember to report how the temperature changes, Marcus instructed. Pay attention to any cold spots where air might be leaking in. Notice how your body heat affects the small space. The reports came back with excitement in every voice. The wind stopped completely once I sealed the entrance, reported Keth of Relian. I can hear it outside, but I cannot feel it at all. My suit's external temperature sensors show negative 140 degrees outside, said the crystalline. But inside my shelter it is already negative 90 and still rising. This is remarkable. Even Rek, whose entrance had initially collapsed, reported success after making the corrections. I'm actually warm, the Scaled One said with wonder. On a world my people classified as uninhabitable without technology, I am warm in a house made of snow. Marcus smiled inside his helmet. This was the moment he loved most in teaching, when students truly understood not just how to do something, but why it worked. After 30 minutes, he called the students out of their shelters. They gathered around him, their body language showing excitement despite the harsh environment. What you've learned today goes beyond Igloo building, Marcus told them. You've learned to see your environment differently, not as something to fight against or to fear, but as a resource. This principle applies everywhere. A military officer who had been observing the workshop approached Marcus. Commander Thex was a high-ranking Vrelian, responsible for training special operations teams. Instructor Chen, I have a request, Commander Thex said. My teams often operate in extreme environments. We rely heavily on technological solutions, powered shelters, thermal generators, supply drops. But technology fails, especially in combat conditions. I want you to train my soldiers in these techniques. Marcus felt a moment of hesitation. His knowledge being used for military purposes made him uncomfortable, but Commander Thex seemed to sense his concern. Not for conquest, the commander clarified, for survival. When a mission goes wrong and a team is stranded, this knowledge could save lives. Will you help us? Marcus considered carefully before responding. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn, he said finally. But I'll teach these skills as tools for survival and building, not destruction. If your soldiers understand that, then yes, I'll help train them. Commander Thex made a gesture of respect. Those terms are acceptable. My soldiers will learn to build, not destroy. Over the following months, Marcus's role expanded beyond what he had ever imagined. He taught military teams, colonial pioneers, research scientists, and adventure tourists. The Igloo became the first and most famous example, but he had begun sharing other traditional human knowledge as well. Desert survival techniques from Earth, Sahara, and Australian outback jungle navigation skills from the Amazon and Congo Ocean, survival from Pacific Island cultures. Each workshop revealed new insights not just about survival, but about the human approach to environmental challenges. Other species began sharing their own traditional knowledge. In return, a Vrelian elder taught techniques for surviving in thin atmospheres that our mountain-dwelling ancestors had developed. A crystalline master shared methods for finding water in seemingly barren, rocky environments. The Thaxians contributed knowledge about surviving in high radiation zones using natural materials. Professor Selthar's proposal for documenting traditional knowledge across the galaxy gained support from the highest levels of galactic government. Funding was approved for a massive research initiative. The Galactic Traditional Knowledge Archive. Marcus was appointed as one of the lead researchers. Despite still being technically a student, his formal classes continued, but now they were supplemented by his work preserving and teaching ancestral wisdom. One evening, Marcus received a communication from an unexpected source. The Galactic Colonial Authority wanted to meet with him about a new settlement being planned. The planet was called Frost Haven. a world in the outer rim with vast frozen continents and rich mineral deposits. We've surveyed Frosthaven extensively, explained Administrator VOR, a elderly crystalline. The resources there could support a colony of 50,000 within a decade. But the environmental challenges are severe. Temperatures average negative 130 degrees. Storms are frequent and violent. We were prepared to classify it as requiring full technological infrastructure for any settlement, Administrator. VO's crystalline features brightened. But then we heard about your work on Crivo 7 and other ice worlds. We want to propose something unprecedented. A settlement built using traditional Igloo techniques combined with modern materials and technology. A hybrid approach that uses environmental resources supplemented by advanced systems, rather than fighting against the environment entirely.